Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, former international broadcaster Mark Pomar on Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, and the Cold War.
So the Voice of America came online shortly after Pearl Harbor, and the first words were in German. And they were, "We will tell you the truth whether it is good for us or not." Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, it came about in the late 1940s as displaced persons, people who had fled the Red Army. And the idea behind it in the United States was we have a treasure of people with great expertise and connection to these newly communized countries. How can we put them to good use? And they themselves want to be put to good use. They themselves want to continue the fight against the Soviet Union. I remember with Putin's third term in 2012, the cold and icy wind of the Cold War could be felt. The Soviet Union was coming back.
Mark Pomar, welcome to Chatter.
Nice to be here.
I've been curious for a while since reading some presidential biographies of the 70s and 80s and other Cold War history. Almost always, Voice of America and or Radio Free Europe and or Radio Liberty comes up. And I've always wanted to dig deeper. And I finally found someone I could talk to dig way deeper because, as I recall, you were the executive director of the Board for International Broadcasting. You served as the director of the USSR Division at the Voice of America. But you also were a former assistant director of the Russian service at the radios. So you've got a lot of personal experience with this, as well as doing research on the history of it independently. So I'm glad you could join me today to talk about this great history.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, David. And I have to say that the radios are mentioned in a number of works, but very rarely do people actually spend any time digging and finding out what they were like. Yeah. And very often, and this is something I have found to be the case, very often they're dismissed with some cliche that somebody happened to come across. And I can tell you an interesting little story. There's a distinguished professor of political science at Dartmouth, whose name I will not mention, who managed in one of the Foreign Affairs articles a few years ago to casually refer to Radio Liberty and be completely, absolutely wrong. Oh, I thought, I need to do something about it. So I wrote him a very polite note saying, sir, it would be very good if you're going to be mentioning Radio Liberty that you really do X, Y, and Z. To his credit, he answered me. I have no idea whether he actually read my book, but I did recommend. But he is indicative of what I have come across so often, time and again, that somebody heard something, they either like it and they therefore praise it, or they don't like the radios and therefore they condemn it without actually knowing what was broadcast.
Right.
So my goal in the book was to sort of say, hey, these are the programs that are going on the air.
And this is, the book you're referring to is Cold War Radio, the Russian broadcasts of the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which you published a couple of years ago now, right?
2 years ago, just 2022.
Okay. So I'm interested in the history of it for exactly that reason, which is I talk about a lot of things and talk to people about many things, and I don't like getting things wrong. So if I can have someone explain it to me, I want to be able to pass on the truth instead of pass on myths and misconceptions. So let's start from the beginning. Obviously radio didn't exist forever, and neither did Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, or Voice of America. The origins actually seem to be in World War II with the Coordinator of Information, OSS, that area. Is that right?
Well, Voice of America comes earlier. Okay. And it's interesting to note that by the 1930s, every major country and many small countries had international broadcasting. We all know the BBC, but so is Radio Moscow, so is Radio Vatican, and on and on and on. The United States did not. And advisors to President Roosevelt said, we should join the new game. I mean, this is a technology where we can make our story known throughout the world. Remember, shortwave radio through its hops, as they call it, can reach 3, 4, 5,000 miles on 2 hops, 7, 8,000 miles. So you have quite a range to be able to reach people with your programming, with your country, with your views, and so forth. And Roosevelt resisted. And this is an interesting point. He resisted partly because commercial broadcasters in the United States wanted to dominate shortwave broadcasting. So we had shortwave broadcasting, but it was privately done. And World War II changed it. World War II basically said the United States has to be part of the war effort. Part of the war effort is information.
Mm-hmm.
So the Voice of America came online shortly after Pearl Harbor. And the first words were in German. And they were, "We will tell you the truth, whether it is good for us or not." And VOA made there's some really interesting people working for Roosevelt, among them Robert Sherwood, a very interesting and important American playwright and writer, speechwriter, known to have coined the phrase arsenal of democracy. I think that is one of Sherwood's key phrases that Roosevelt went on to use. And he basically said, look, we will be different from BBC. We will be different from the others because we will actually talk about our losses, where we lost a battle. And the Voice of America developed a very strong reputation in many different languages. So but you didn't have Russian. This is interesting. You did not have Russian because that would be uncomfortable for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was our ally.
Yeah.
Soviet Union would not want us to be broadcasting in Russian and talking directly to their people without their control in the Kremlin as to what is going to be said. And so in deference to our friend Uncle Joe Stalin, there was no Russian broadcast until 1947.
Wow.
As the Cold War began. And that's a very interesting way in which the VOA started broadcasting, because it was really prodded, because the BBC went on in Russia in 1946. And so, competition with the British, you can't let the British get too far ahead. You've got to be there as well.
Mark, you mentioned something in there I want to make sure we don't lose, which is from the start, the core principle of the broadcasting from the US was that this is an unvarnished presentation of the truth. That is, this is journalistic reporting with integrity and ethics. It is not a state propaganda effort like some other countries had done.
And this is, not only was that super important, but it was at a time of war. And war, as you know, as our listeners know, is a time when countries have to win. They go to the edge of a lot of things that normally in peacetime one would not do. But the Voice had a very good reputation. It hired very interesting people, actors. Yul Brynner was one of the broadcasters of VOA in the French service, actually. And it was really an effort to sort of showcase an American approach. It was attested to by people who later testified at various hearings after the war, both the Japanese and the Germans, that yes, we turned into VOA because we got a much more accurate picture of what was going on than we would even get from our own media. So VOA developed a good reputation. It was generally a politically left sooner than right. It was sort of the New Deal liberals that kind of ran VOA. And it became accused, it was part of the accusations that McCarthy leveled at the State Department. He says, VOA is no good. They are pandering to X, Y, and Z, which wasn't the case, but just to give our listeners a sense that VOA was very much a product of American society at that time, rather than some nefarious secret covert government operations. Very open. It operated, hiring personalities, journalists, doing interviews. So I think its early history is fascinating. And if anything, it had, as I said, more of a left of center bent than a right.
Right. Do I recall that during the war that it actually rankled the U.S. military some that they did not like the coverage of some issues that they were directly involved in North Africa and elsewhere.
Yes, and I chat about that a little bit in the or write about it a little bit in the book. Yes, they were very adamant that the group that Sherwood brought together were very adamant that they are going to expose what is going on. They one of the commentaries had about Italy and the problems that were taking place there that really did not suit the U.S. government, and in some ways the Roosevelt administration had to, as they say, crack down. This is, after all, a war, and you can't just go totally haywire. So you had to stay in a war situation. You had to stay within the bounds of what was military policy as well. If anything, VOA wanted to be a completely and totally independent of the war effort, and that, of course, was not always 100% possible.
I want to set the stage before we get to the bulk of our conversation, which will be about the Cold War itself. So when the functions are transferred to the State Department in, I think, late 1945, what is the status of the broadcasting? Is it a mix between news and music? Is it still trying to communicate a message primarily, or is it trying to reach people? How was that balance reached between, the people who wanted it to be solely a mouthpiece, but also be entertaining to people listening to it?
Well, the VOA, first of all, is a VOA of many different languages, and each of the language services has a certain amount of autonomy to build its own program. So when one talks about VOA, one should really be talking about it in the plural rather than the singular tense, because really you have different language services understanding that they will best appeal to their audience and reach them in different ways. So that the English service is the general one that is worldwide, but then the Spanish service, the French service, later on the Russian service, they all have their own peculiarities as to what they feel would be most effective. You always start with the news. Every hour starts, the broadcast hour starts with 10 minutes of the news produced centrally, and virtually the same news that you would hear or read on AP or UPI or whatever other news service one would look at. And
Okay.
then what was called the back end of the hour, you could do current events, you could do culture, you could do programming on whatever the division felt or the service felt was most effective for its audience. So curiously, for big parts of the world, one of the ways to reach that part of the world was through American entertainment, something that was banned, something that was not allowed. For example, one of the most popular programs in the Russian service was the Jazz Hour with Willis Conover. He's actually probably the most famous DJ in the world, American DJ, who had fan clubs in Poland and China and the Soviet Union because he was the voice of American jazz. And he would introduce, he would talk, somebody from the language service would translate into the appropriate language. And so you could reach and encourage people who would listen to the jazz program, who then may stay on to listen to the news or may want to hear the latest speech by the president and reaction to it. Mm-hmm. And VOA was always very much by the book. In other words, it was not the voice of any particular administration. It was the voice of the United States. And so
Right.
whatever administration was in power, they would obviously give its views, but they would give responsible criticism of those views. And that was embedded in the VOA charter, very much set in stone. And I think overall, very much a success. I think if one were to listen, and I would encourage our listeners to go on the U.S. Agency for Global Media website, find VOA, touch on it, and you can listen, watch, and make up your own judgment, which is, by the way, something, David, that you couldn't do in the past, because in the past, it was a shortwave broadcast that wasn't broadcast into the United States. It was broadcast outside. It was hard to access. So most Americans only knew about these radios if they traveled abroad or if they lived abroad, but if they lived at home. And that was very purposefully done so that VOA wouldn't compete with commercial broadcasters. The
Right. It makes
fear,
sense given the
Roosevelt
times.
administration, the Truman administration, the Eisenhower, those early years was somehow the
Hmm.
government would dominate the news cycle in the United States. And what you wanted to do is say, okay, you can have news, you can have information, but it has to be abroad, it has to go outside the
Yeah.
United States.
Talk a bit, if you will, Mark, about the tension that emerged relatively early on and that carried through the decades in many ways at VOA between what you call the strategists and the purists. What was the divide there, and how did it illuminate a lot about how the broadcasting shaped up during the Cold War?
Well, that's probably the key to both radios, both Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, as well as VOA. But at VOA, it was very, very openly discussed that you had uh, a part of the VOA, kind of the core part of the VOA, that was very much we broadcast the news. The news is the news. It could be good, it could be bad. If we have lynchings in the South, we're going to talk about them. If we have race riots, and as we did in the 1960s, we're going to give them full coverage. Watergate is probably one of the kind of markers of VOA influence. And I personally know, and I've talked to Soviets back 20, 30 years ago, who said that when they listened to the Voice of America coverage of Watergate, they finally understood how a free press operates in a country where such coverage would be impossible to do. The VOA covered Watergate, covered the hearings, as did any other reputable news. So those were the purists.
But that is remarkable in and of itself when you think about some of the other countries, and I'm more familiar with some other countries' official broadcasts.
Yeah.
And there's no way they would be exposing the dirty laundry of
No
the
way.
political
And
elite.
Roger told me, we started really listening to VOA as a
Yeah.
result of that. The other very interesting story, and I think this is something that our listeners might really appreciate, the VOA coverage of the civil rights movement was one of the contributing factors to the Soviet dissident movement. Dissidents have written that they listened to Martin Luther King, they listened to the sort of peaceful resistance, legalistic argument that civil rights violated American law, was the argument that they would use as dissidents in the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 70s, saying, you, the Soviet Union, have signed the Helsinki Accord. You have signed all these, the Constitution tells us, and you are violating those very laws.
Exactly.
That was something that they,
Yeah.
many ways, learned and understood through the VOA coverage of the civil rights movement. Now, on the other side, you had people in Congress saying this. So this is not a VOA issue, and you had some in the White House saying, hey, we're putting in all this money. What are you doing to move the freedom agenda in the Soviet Union? And this was a lot of battles, so that the strategists would say, look, the Soviet Union banned Solzhenitsyn, okay? They exile him. He's in the United States. We should be broadcasting his works day in and day out. The Jewish refuseniks of the early 1970s, they're being arrested. They're not being allowed. We should be having a program about the Jewish refuseniks every single day, telling Soviets that they are violating. In other words, you find the issues that the Soviet Union is not covering. You find the issues that they are repressing, whether it's about Stalin, whether it's about, the latest issues regarding human rights, arrests, people being sent to the Gulag, and this is what you focus on. And that caused a lot of controversy back and forth. I can tell you that up until detente, up until the whole idea that we should be friendly with the Soviet Union. This is the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty were, broadcast a lot of things that were, shall we say, not pleasing to the Kremlin. Starting with detente, there was tension, especially coming from the State Department, USIA, U.S. International Information Agency, that said, tone it down. Don't get too excited about this stuff. And there's a famous one where the director of USIA said, "We're not broadcasting Solzhenitsyn's Gulag." Because that would be outside of our normal broadcasting approach. And it caused, of course, a real kerfuffle everywhere, including on the Hill, with some of the congressmen coming out and saying, "Now, wait a second, we're giving money to the Voice of America precisely to be able to do this kind of work. And you're telling us, no, we shouldn't upset the Soviets, therefore let's hold off." And so I think the tension went back and forth over the years. During the détente years, it was much harder at VOA to broadcast about dissidents, to broadcast about human rights violations, to broadcast writers who were banned in the Soviet Union. The remarkable thing that happens in the early 80s with the Reagan administration, which is the years where I was in government, was the freedom that we were given. We were able to put anyone we wished on the air.
Which was a real contrast after the détente years, right?
It was great contrast. So from the perspective of broadcasting, détente was a rather, it was a time of control. It was a time of having to not upset someone. And yet the whole point of journalism, and this is a point that I believe very strongly, is to tell the truth. Obviously, we're not making up facts. We are following the facts. We're following newsworthy information, but not to hold back and say, well, we can't really upset the powers. To be quite the contrary, our role is to upset the powers. Is precisely to get issues in the public sphere that otherwise would not be there. And, people talk about the importance of Andrei Sakharov, they talk about the importance of Solzhenitsyn, but what they forget is that without radio broadcasting, and by that I mean not just VOA, I mean BBC, and I mean Deutsche Welle, and I mean Radio France International, Radio Free Europe, I mean all the entire, without that international broadcasting, Sakharov and other dissidents, Jewish refuseniks, would simply not be known about in the Soviet Union. So I think the role they played in furthering the human rights agenda is one that has been deeply underappreciated, understudied, not fully comprehended by people who claim to be experts on this field.
Right. One thread in there that I want to pull has to do with the détente era, because one of the themes of the radios over many decades is, there may be a little bending with the winds of political change, like during détente, not covering certain things, but it never breaks. There's always a way through, even if people are grumbling and very upset about some editorial decisions. But it didn't break. But it did come close, because I remember a story, and maybe you wrote about it, but I thought I saw it elsewhere as well, that during détente, Kissinger wanted to offer Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty as bargaining chips with the Soviet Union, that in some negotiation, if they were going to give something, that he would say, fine, we will shut down the radios. Is that urban legend, or is that true?
No, that is absolutely true. But I think to give it context, I think we should sort of step aside a little bit and explain that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was a very different animal from Voice of America.
Yeah, that's good. Let's talk about those differences. That's a good point.
Because Kissinger could not negotiate away VOA, for example, but he could negotiate RFERL, or try to negotiate. And the reason being was that Voice of America was set up through an act of Congress in the creation of the United States Information Agency under President Eisenhower, a strong supporter of Voice of America, as were Truman and Kennedy. Kennedy actually came to the VOA for its 20th anniversary and met with the journalists and so forth. So there was strong White House support, but it was a matter of law. There was a law, public law, that created the institution. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has a very interesting history. In many ways, I think one that needs far more exploration than has been the case. But it came about in the late 1940s as displaced persons, which was the term used, people who had fled the Red Army, whether from Eastern Europe, from the Soviet Union, and were basically in the American sector in Germany, living in work camps, basically displaced person camps. And the idea behind it of the United States was we have a treasure of people with great expertise and connection to these newly communized countries, if you wish, in Eastern Europe and then the Soviet Union. How can we put them to good use? And they themselves want to be put to good use. They themselves want to continue the fight against the Soviet Union. And in many ways, Kennan was one of the architects. There were others, Robert Kelly and others in the administration, who said, well, we should set up these committees that would fund them. And it's a long history. It's a complicated history. But just the nub of it, the core of it is that the radios were set up as if they were home radio stations for the countries that had been taken over. So the Polish service, Radio Free Europe for Eastern Europe, Radio Liberty for the Soviet Union, that's the division.
Got it.
And so you had a Polish service that broadcast out of Munich, employing recent Polish journalists, ministers in the government between the wars, broadcasting to Poland as if they were sitting in Warsaw. They were sitting in Munich. And the same would be true for the Czech service. The same thing would be true for the Hungarians, for the Russians, for the Ukrainians, for the Estonians. So they were a program. They were not part of law. And they were funded by the CIA to make it easier to fund and this is maybe the downfall, and not the downfall, but maybe the problem that radios ran into, so that you wouldn't have to argue for two separate stations in Congress every year for appropriations. So you argued for VOA, but RFERL was tucked under the overall budget. Now, committees and members of the House and Senate were briefed on it, but it was not something that was in the public arena. And the pretense of it was that we have a private committee called the Free Europe Committee and the American Committee for Liberation from Bolshevism on the Radio Liberty side that were getting private donations. And they were private monies raised. I mean, there was a whole system of raising funds for the Crusade for Freedom in the late 1940s, 50s. If our listeners go on YouTube, you can find Reagan on YouTube talking about the importance of contributing your dollars to the Freedom Campaign and so forth for Radio Free Europe and so forth. So when detente hit, and the Soviets hated the radios, the Soviets hated Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty far more than VOA because it was hitting them in the sore spots that they really wanted to control.
It's hard to measure effectiveness for things like this, but that is one measure of effectiveness, that they were so opposed to it.
And the jamming that they involved, and they would jam the broadcast, which costs a lot of money. And so during detente, the issue came up for Kissinger, I'm sure, in his meetings with Dobrynin, in his meetings with Brezhnev, saying, hey, we really don't like this Radio Liberty. We just can't stand it. Maybe we can do some kind of deal. And I think that was very much in the offing in the late 60s when that memo, which is, by the way, declassified, and any of our listeners can go on the Woodrow Wilson website, Cold War Project, and find it and read it for themselves. I mean, it's there. And I think it was the time that those kinds of deals would be possible. We have to remember that Clifford Case got up and accused the radios of deceiving, or accused the CIA of funding the radios and therefore deceiving the American public in terms of where Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty funds were coming. Then you have the Fulbright hearings, in which Senator Fulbright made really nasty remarks about the radios, saying they were relics of a war and they should be given their rightful place in the cemetery of war relics, or something to that effect. I mean, these were times I was only a grad student, or actually an undergrad in those years, but I remember just the turning against U.S. government institutions in the late 60s and 70s, a sense of distrust, a sense that everything the U.S. was doing, and this is, of course, the Vietnam War period, that they came under attack in those years.
Yeah.
Very easy.
Let me go back to one thing you mentioned in there. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, we call them the radios. Often they're just put together as one big lump, but there were some differences. And I have the impression that one of them is that Radio Free Europe in some senses was easier early on because so many immigrants knew the people behind the Iron Curtain. They literally knew some of the leaders in the country as that they had left behind. Whereas Radio Liberty seems to have had a bigger challenge because of the relative lack of full information and cultural understanding of Russia. Is that generally true? And was that true for the time that you got there in the 80s? Or did you have enough true Russian input that had balanced out somewhat?
Well, I think the beginning part is absolutely true, because what happened in the late 40s and early 50s is the governments and the societies of Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and all the countries that were being overrun by the Red Army as its final assault on Nazi Germany, they fled. Those who were not willing to be communists, who did not want to work with the Soviet Union, kind of fled west. And so you had in the West a really highly educated emigre population, if you wish. In the case of the Soviet Union, you had hundreds of thousands of POWs that had been captured by the Nazis. You had people who had fled the Soviet Union, but they represented just rural areas. They were not necessarily the elite, if you want to call them that. They were very important. They knew and understood the day-to-day workings of the Soviet Union for sure, and many of them made contributions. I don't want to overgeneralize, because there were obviously excellent poets and writers in that among the displaced persons. That would be important to note. But as a general rule, Eastern Europe had an easier time. Radio Free Europe had an easier time because it was clear to everyone that these were captured countries. They were captured by the Soviet Union. They had been promised independence, and this is very important. They had been promised independence in Yalta, and that never took place. So there was always the sense on the American side that we had somehow let down these countries that needed and wanted to be independent. After all, Poland fought on the side of the Allies more than had in any other country. It had, divisions in the UK fighting the Germans from different sides. They resisted. So they were heroic in so many respects. And here we were letting them be overrun by. So the sense of Eastern Europe and the support for Radio Free Europe as a result was always quite strong. In the case of Radio Liberty, is a little bit trickier. The small broadcasts, what I mean by small are the nations within the Soviet Union. So in addition to Russians, very important to note, extremely important to note, that Radio Liberty was not just Russia. Radio Liberty was Ukrainian, Belarusian, Tajik, Turkmen, Armenian, Georgian, Kazakh, 20 languages of the Soviet Union. This was, after all, an empire. Yeah. And we, unlike the others, and this is very important to note, unlike the other broadcasters like BBC, for example, we broadcast in all these different languages, which made us very, very different from the get-go. And of course, in time, the Soviet Union fell apart precisely along those national lines. So we were, in a sense, contributing to that, whether consciously or not, to that final dissolution of the Soviet Union, which is another reason why the Soviet government did not like us, because
of course,
we were on these different languages.
I want to ask you about a different aspect of that. So the history, as archives especially have become more open in recent decades, history shows that many, if not most, Western institutions were infiltrated to various degrees by the KGB early in the Cold War. What have you been able to discern about the level of KGB infiltration of Radio Liberty throughout its operations?
Well, there have been many instances where KGB agents were there. I had one particular experience where someone who technically reported to me by the name of Oleg Tumanov, an editor in the Russian service, redefected. In other words, he had defected, or supposedly defected, years earlier, had gone through some kind of filtration system in terms of his bona fides, and was hired by the radios. Was actually, I knew him quite well, rather quiet, drank a lot. The only thing about Oleg I remember is he was one of these heavy Russian drinkers. Simple guy from a simple family, not an intellectual, watched Soviet movies all the time, which we found kind of curious.
Hmm.
And turns out that he had been presumably, I'm not an expert in this area, but presumably been turned around by the Soviets. In other words, he had defected, and then Soviet agents had come his way and said, you can work for the motherland, you can help. Very patriotic guy. And he turned and worked for them. And at some point, somebody must have defected who would identify him, and so he was quickly brought back to the Soviet Union. He gave a press conference to denounce the organization where he had worked for 20 years. I found it rather peculiar that he mentioned me by name, saying that I traveled around the world with my diplomatic passport and therefore was an awfully dangerous person to be in. But, these things come with the territory.
Yeah.
But so that's one kind of case that we all know it happened in the 1980s. But there had been, I'm sure, inevitably people who had worked because the radios were, first of all, they were an open organization. There was no classified material at the radios. The sources were open. The place was quite accessible to anybody. And I think the Soviets agents not so much were there to find some deep, dark secrets of America, but rather as a convenient place to monitor other activities. It was a place to set someone up who then would be monitoring maybe the military bases in Germany or following emigres who were very vocal in their criticism of the Soviet Union. In other words, it was a nice place to put someone. And as journalists, they travel all the time. So it's not at all unusual to have someone on the road for weeks at a time.
That makes sense.
From their perspective, it was obviously a very convenient place to place. And I think the East Europeans were probably even more active.
Right.
The radios were bombed in 1981. And part of the building was taken down. No one got killed. Some people got hurt. And it was attributed to probably Romanian secret services that were after the Romanian service. Romanian service was very important to Radio Free Europe and had some really important people who got under the skin of Ceausescu, he really hated these people. They had defected. This is the other thing to keep in mind about the radios. VOA was a little bit skittish about having defectors on the air for long programs. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty did not. And I had a kind of a curious experience, if you wish. One of the professors at Columbia that I knew, Severin Bialer, very famous professor of Soviet, was a defector from Poland. He defected in the early 1950s. And soon after his defection, he went on to Radio Liberty and gave a series of broadcasts of the inner workings of the Communist Party of Poland on Radio Free Europe, which was listened to with the greatest of interest because he was able to reveal one episode after another, episodes of corruption, episodes of kowtowing to the Soviets, inside meetings that had been taking place. Much the same thing happened in the Polish service with Joseph Światło, who was another defector, who did a whole series of programs. By the time I was at the radios, we weren't doing quite that kind of programming, but we would have people who were exiled by the Soviet Union, people who had been pushed out by the Soviets, dissidents who had sat for years in the Gulag, talk about their experience directly to listeners. And that was part of what Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty did. And it was a very important one because no one else really would do that kind of broadcast.
Talk a little bit, if you will, about the management. You've already mentioned the different paths for VOA and for the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So, the more clandestine side in the latter case. But, when and why did the Board of International Broadcasting develop, and what did that do to the actual management and control of the broadcasting going forward?
Well, there are two periods in the history of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. There are what oftentimes the old class called the CIA years and the post-CIA years. And they're very different from what I can gather. There are very few people around from the CIA days anymore, but the books and memoirs that I've read and people I've talked to earlier who had worked in those years, they actually liked that period very much. They said they were pretty much left alone by the CIA. There was one officer who sort of oversaw the operations, and basically they were left alone to do their thing. 1971 ends all CIA funding for the radios. They go through a period where their existence is virtually very tenuous, and they finally are put under a specially created small federal agency called the Board for International Broadcasting, by law to be bipartisan, with its chair of the party of the president. And they had a small staff, and then they selected the president, and they oversaw the operations of the radios. And my experience as executive director in the late 80s and early 90s was that it was overall a successful operation, because we in Washington kind of were the face of the radios to the government. Meanwhile, we protected them, in a sense, to do their work in Munich. Right. And I think we testified, the chair at the time when I was there was Steve Forbes, of Forbes magazine. He was the chair. And we had a very illustrious board of directors, including James Michener, the author of many, many historical novels, was on our board, and Lane Kirkland, the head of the AFL-CIO, was on our board. So it was a very prestigious American board of Democrats and Republicans, very, very bipartisan. And we, as government employees, were nonpartisan. We were career civil servants. So I think the idea was that we would represent what the radios were doing, how they were doing. We would argue for the budget. We would oversee the programs. We had a whole series of evaluations of the programs done by independent evaluators. So we kind of took over that operation, but made it totally public, totally open. And I think it worked to the benefit of the radios, because they really were not a clandestine operation anyway. And I think having them funded by the CIA confused their mission, maybe gave a perception of them that really didn't correspond to reality.
Yeah. I want to ask about a couple of specific incidents as we get through the 1980s, and then focus a little bit on the end of the Cold War and the remarkable stories around the radio there. But first, one anecdote that just blew me away is that, I think it was August 1984, when Ronald Reagan famously is recording and does a little off-the-cuff comment about, I've decided to end the Soviet Union forever. Bombing begins in 5 minutes, something like that.
Yes, yeah.
How did VOA cover that? Because that was covered in the United States, but one would think that that kind of a gaffe, if you will, although I'm not sure everybody saw it that way, but that kind of a gaffe would be something that wouldn't be exposed. But how did VOA cover that?
Well, I got a call from the editor of the Russian news desk saying, this is coming across as the news. What do we do? I mean, after all, we're broadcasting in the Russian language. What do we do? And I immediately said, well, the VOA charter says you broadcasted. Now, you don't have to do it 25 times. You don't have to repeat it every hour on the hour for the next 2 days. We're not trying to score political points, but you've got to have it on the air. Otherwise, we will have violated our charter. I then realized that, well, maybe this deserves a call to the director of the VOA. Privately at home, I called Ken Tomlinson, who was then the director, and Ken said, well, it's unfortunate, it's a dumb remark, but good thing that you did it. And then we have to do it, because this is very important to note that the VOA was very much in the public eye in terms of, did it adhere to its charter? And adhering to its charter was very, very, it was public law. And anything that violates public law, first of all, we took an oath to uphold the law, to do what we thought was proper by the legislation. And I think people in Congress were looking at very carefully what you did, what you didn't do. And hearings would be there if you didn't. And I think the administration, I'm sure it upset somebody in the White House. That's inevitable. But I think the administration as a whole is very understanding that these are things that are in the news. They have to be in the news. We must broadcast them.
And that case
Yeah.
itself is unique because of the unique nature of the comment and what happened. But was your interaction with the director, is that reflective of the kind of attitude you had over the years, that everybody understood that about the charter? It was part of the DNA of the organization that, yeah, this is just what we do. And sure, somebody at the State Department or the White House or Congress is going to give us some flack, but we just hold up the public law and say this is what we do.
Well, ideally, that's exactly what happened. But of course, anytime you bring together passionate people in any organization, you're bound to have all kinds of different views expressed. Some old timers, by old timers, I mean people who worked in the 60s and 70s, felt that we were too eager to put dissidents on the air, and that somehow that wasn't the proper role for Radio Liberty. Why are you putting people who are such harsh critics of the Soviet Union? We had famous musician Slava Rostropovich, who was then the director of the National Symphony in Washington, do a whole series of wonderful interviews. I actually did the interviews with him in Russian, and he talked about what it was to be a free musician in the West. His wife, Galina Vishnevskaya, the opera star, read from her memoirs, which were very harshly critical of the Soviet. For some of the old timers, that smacked of an older period, or they felt that was the role of Radio Liberty, but not necessarily VOA. But I was blessed in the 80s. I really have to admit that the administration of VOA, I thought, was remarkably professional, remarkably open, easy to deal with, and I remember them all fondly. Unfortunately, they've passed away by now, but I remember Ken Tomlinson and Gene Pell as really excellent directors of the VOA and model directors, if you wish, for, I think, that kind of an organization. Both, by the way, came from private journalism. In the case of Radio Liberty, we also had some remarkable directors, but Radio Liberty was more, because it was further from Washington, it just had greater freedom, if you wish, to kind of do its own thing in Munich and not be so much under the eye. Having your headquarters on Independence Avenue just invited a lot of people to look over your shoulder as to what you were doing.
Right on. I want to talk about a direct personal experience of yours. So you had been to the Soviet Union up into the 1970s, but if I recall, it wasn't until 1987 that you went again. And this is when Gorbachev was in power and Glasnost was starting. Talk about how someone who's affiliated with this, the U.S. broadcasting networks, which for years had been, criticized by the Soviet authorities, that you had been deemed an enemy of the people of the Soviet Union. How did you actually get into the country? And for that first visit, what actually happened to the meetings when you got there and showed up for these meetings that had been scheduled?
Yeah, I should sort of step back for a second and say that anyone joining Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, as I did in 1982, signed a piece of paper saying we would not travel to the East Bloc under any circumstances. That was part of the employment agreement. They also cautioned us about going to countries where we might encounter problems, stayed at Western Europe and the United States or whatever, but we specifically could not. There was a prohibition on going to it. Of course, Gorbachev's glasnost started opening up all kinds of questions that had never been broached before. And one of them was the question of jamming. And in 1987, the ambassador to the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, wrote to the Board for International Broadcasting and said, we are seeing openings about maybe stopping jamming and kind of regularizing the relationship. We're not sure how far they would go, but I would recommend that representatives of the Board for National Broadcasting come to the Soviet Union and engage in initial meetings. And so I and a colleague of mine were selected to go because we were career civil servants. We were given diplomatic passports. And we applied for a visa, not thinking we would be given a visa but to our surprise, at the very last minute, about a day before our flight was supposed to take off, and we had tickets, the visas came through. And we indeed landed. The first thing that the ambassador told us was, look, stay on the grounds of the embassy, because you never know what kind of incident you might encounter in a tourist hotel. So we stayed on the grounds of the embassy in some of the new townhouses that had just been built. And we went to our first meeting, and lo and behold, the person we were supposed to meet at the Soviet radio, USSR Radio, was sick and didn't show up. And we went to a second meeting, and by God, that person was late and wasn't going to come either. And finally, we realized that no one
gets suspicious fast
was going to meet with us. And I think the reason was because they couldn't figure out, they could get into trouble no matter what they said. If they were too friendly with us, well, then, you're not loyal. The signal hadn't come from the top as to how they're supposed to treat people who represent the radios. And since the signal hadn't come, it's best to be sick and just not show up and slough it up. So basically, the entire week we had these meetings set up. We never went to, and we went to all of them. None of them took place. We enjoyed the week. No incident took place. And so then we got on the plane and left. And curiously, when we got to Munich to report on our trip, people in the Russian service thought we were insane to go. He says, any incident could have happened. You could have ended up in the gulag. Don't you understand? But, being young and adventuresome, it didn't strike me as anything but a great fun week in my life. The next year, the USIA under Charlie Wick organized a big American-Soviet meeting to talk about information. And we were part of it, and everything changed. So when people ask me about change in the Soviet Union, I say October 1987, it's still very much the Soviet Union. October 1988, it's a different country. And I think that those 12 months, in my mind, are some of the most crucial 12 months in the disintegration of the Soviet Union, 87 to 88.
Now, as you mentioned, there was still jamming going on, even though there was openness, and the tone certainly was starting to change in 87. There was still the issue of, is the message getting through to the people that this is aimed at? So talk about how and when jamming finally ended.
In 1988, October 88, when we had the big information talks where we were part of a big American delegation, we had a separate meeting with Mr. Valentin Falin, who was head of the Novosti news agency. And he told us those memorable words, which I shall never forget. We, he said, have noticed an improvement in the broadcast of Radio Liberty. Well, nothing had changed in Radio Liberty, but they
had doing what you did all along.
Changed. And we thought, wow, that is something very, very new. And lo and behold, about a month later, all jamming, 100% ceased. Just clear signal. You could go in, you could be heard anywhere. Now, mind you, up until then, once you got outside the big cities, where the jamming stations were mostly located, you could hear Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, VOA relatively easily. But once you got inside the city, especially if you lived near one of those jamming stations, and they looked kind of like our, cell phone towers. I mean, there were towers that went up in various parts of the city. Then, of course, it would be distorted. Everything was clear. Everything was coming in, and we couldn't believe it. And what the radios did very smartly, was immediately started hiring local correspondents.
Yeah.
Because now they could report, and their reports would go back. And that changed so quickly. It moved so fast that within a couple of years, Radio Liberty was on local AM, FM stations. I mean, It was just then rebroadcast in country.
That's amazing. So one of the best incidents from this time has to do with the August 1991 coup attempt. So, the kind of the Wikipedia version of history is, of course, the Soviet Union opens up. It leads to the revolutions in Eastern Europe. There's just the era of openness. Everybody's listening. Everybody's happy, but not everybody's happy. So a few a few leaders in the August Putsch push back, do a very, very clumsy attempt at a coup against Gorbachev. But I was unaware until recently the role that the radios played in this. So from your perspective, talk through the events of August 1991 and what happened during that with what the radios were doing and what leaders were saying about the radios during and after August 1991.
In many ways, the putsch, the period in August, is Radio Liberty's finest hour. And I say that because by then there was a functioning bureau in Moscow. There were correspondents, freelance correspondents throughout the Soviet Union. And there was a direct telephone line to Munich headquarters that existed. And when the putsch took place, the Soviet authorities, as you properly said clumsily, well, they closed down all Soviet media. They played, Swan Lake on Soviet TV. Journalists were no longer able to put out any of their news reports, but they didn't know how, or perhaps they decided not to, or they were unaware. They didn't close down Radio Liberty, nor BBC, nor VOA. So in fairness, they didn't close down the international broadcasters. But of the three, Radio Liberty had the most amount of on-the-ground sources. And so the Radio Liberty put one of its correspondents together with Yeltsin in the White House. It had other correspondents on the streets interviewing people as they were marching against the putschists. They were sending reports from outlying areas of the country, from the different republics, from the Baltic states, from Siberia, and so forth. And it was all funneling into Munich and then being broadcast back to an unjammed Soviet Union. And so Gorbachev, sitting in Crimea, was able to listen to Radio Liberty, VOA, understand what was going on in Moscow based on correspondents that were filing their reports via Munich that were then picked up by people throughout the Soviet Union. And of course, the more they listened, the more people came out on the street, and you had hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Moscow protesting the putsch, and it just then collapses.
I think that's amazing that through Radio Liberty, Gorbachev in his dacha in the Crimea and Western leaders were better informed than the coup leaders were.
And they acknowledged that. They acknowledged it immediately upon, and Yeltsin issued a decree on behalf of the Russian Republic government saying that we now want to open a bureau, that this was outstanding work, that this was in the best interests of the country. And so right after the putsch, I was in Moscow shortly afterwards, and we opened a full-fledged news bureau, which I may add, that news bureau functioned until February 2022.
Yeah.
It was closed because of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So between 1991 and 2022, Radio Liberty had a functioning news bureau in the Soviet Union / Russia for 30 years. And now everything has been closed. And that bureau that we opened with such hope of a new world is now closed.
Talk a little bit, you weren't there at the time, but the time between those two, especially from 2014 to 2022, when, there had been the annexation of Crimea, there had been the little green men in eastern Ukraine, but essentially Russian operations in eastern Ukraine, the shoot down of the airplane over Ukraine, all of that is deteriorating. And yet the radios still functioned, but what were operations like, and did you hear from any of your former colleagues that things were getting into a much more restricted state?
Well, I have to sort of say that I was living and working in Russia from 2008 to 2016 as the president of the U.S.-Russia Foundation. So I was there day in, day out in Moscow until one fine day I was not let into the country and declared a persona non grata after 42 years of going back and forth to the Soviet Union and Russia. So after 42 years, I finally hit the brick wall and I was deported from Russia. But so I was there in 2014 and 2015, obviously not working at the radios, but interacting with some of its journalists. And the pressure was growing everywhere. I can tell you it started earlier than that. I remember with Putin's third term in 2012, the
Right.
cold and icy wind of the Cold War could be felt. The
Mm.
Soviet Union was coming back. Fear was coming back to people. People who would normally interact with Americans, come to our office, deal with us, all of a sudden became scared and they weren't sure whether this was the right thing to do. And I had spent time in the Soviet Union as a Fulbright scholar, and I remember the Soviet Union very well, and that sense of indecision and fear on the part of
It was
citizens
back.
back after almost 30 years of freedom, almost 30 years of sort of being normal and saying what you want to say and going where you want to go.
Hmm.
And that started right with the third term of Putin, and of course accelerated, as you said, with the invasion of Crimea and with the incidences that took place, and built with the new laws, the foreign agent law, the undesirable foreign organization law. All
Right.
of that was a process that culminated, if you wish, in 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, that was a process that started probably 10 years easily, 10 years earlier.
So you personally have little prospect of getting back to Russia anytime soon.
No prospect, no desire.
Yes, there you go. I do want to contrast this before we close with the experience of the radios over the last 20 years in most of Eastern Europe, where you had people like Václav Havel in the Czech Republic saying again, it's just so shocking to these entities that were enemies of the state just within years earlier. He is actually saying, can you come and train us how to do journalism? Talk about how the radios have been perceived by the people in the governments of the other countries in Central and Eastern Europe since the end of the Cold War until today.
I can give you a few examples. One of the most memorable was we had a board meeting very early in 1990 in Budapest. And as part of the board meeting, we were invited by the parliament to come to this beautiful parliament building in Budapest. And we were honored by the speaker for the service that the Americans had done for the Hungarian people. And the entire parliament got up and cheered and clapped of all different parties in 1990.
Hmm.
Similar incident, we had a board meeting in Warsaw, and Lech Walesa, then president of Poland, invited the board to the Belvedere Palace for dinner.
Hmm.
And he greeted all of us. He hugged Lane Kirkland, the head of the AFL-CIO, and he said, "It's because of you that I am here," for all the help that AFL-CIO had provided to Solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
We were in Moscow for the 40th anniversary of Radio Liberty, celebrated in March of 1993. And Gorbachev came, and I had the distinct honor and pleasure of being his interpreter that evening. And he spoke about the role that the radios had played in supporting Russian culture, Russian traditions, Russian literature. And he said, you played an important role. You were not against Russians, you were against the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Moving evening. And then finally, just something that I think Americans can take great pride in. On behalf of several countries of Eastern Europe, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was nominated for the 1991 Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
I think speaks of something. And then maybe the final kind of clincher, Havel invited the radios to move to Prague, where they are now to this day, and gave the main building in downtown Prague as a gift to the American people for the work that the Americans had done. Mm-hmm. So I like to tell people that Radio Free Europe, that began as a covertly funded CIA operation, ended up being a nominee for the 1991 Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, if that is not a great American story, I don't know what is.
I won't reveal my age or yours, but I will say that I do remember the awareness that came to me at that time of the nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. That's something I remember. And I have a feeling that most Americans don't know Radio Free Europe or Radio Liberty except for two things. One of them might be the Nobel Prize if they were just paying attention to broadcasts that day and the news of the week. The other one is the band REM did an early song called Radio Free Europe, which the lyrics are unintelligible and it's not clear it has anything to do with it other than just the nice sound of the words. But that's most people don't dig deep on this because, like you said, it wasn't really available in the US, and it's only historians or people who get involved in a particular culture of another country that had some kind of effect from the radios. So I'm very grateful for your work for bringing out this history. Others have written slices of it, but you pull it together in a very personal way. And I'm curious, what are you doing now? And are you still working on other projects to try to educate people and inform people about the benefits of the radios?
Well, I'm actually had so much fun writing this book that I decided to continue sort of doing research and writing another book that I really want to look at the radios, particularly Radio Liberty, because of its relevance to today, and see what lessons can be learned from what we did in 40 years that could be adapted, applied, considered today, because we are back to a new Cold War. It's a different Cold War, but it's a Cold War. We have a Russia today that is, if you wish, back in the early 1950s, before the first Eisenhower-Khrushchev exchanges of 1957-58. We are back in a Russia that is isolated, that's isolating itself.
Yeah.
We have, again, millions of Russians outside of Russia who are very eager to participate in the political process in one way, and they can do so through information, through news, and so we are again at this beginning stage. How do we shape our strategy in terms of dealing with Russia? And I think looking at both the positive and maybe some of the mistakes the radio's made would be useful in terms of shaping the kind of programming, the kind of approach, the expectations that we could. So I'm looking at it both historically, but trying to pull up the history to today and sort of see where we are today. And I may add just for that today's Radio Liberty is very, very good. I mean, I listen to it pretty much every day. I look at their website. I look at the Russian one because the only language I know of the many languages that Radio Liberty broadcasts in. But it is professional. It is done well. And I'm noticing that the kinds of programs they're choosing, they're doing more historical programs. They're doing more programs in different regions of Russia. They're covering the war in Ukraine very well. That they are doing yeoman's work. And I think looking at what we did in the past may be useful and interesting. In addition to just, as I said, a great story. I think the more written about the radios, the more it will stimulate others to write about it. And my real hope is that people will start using it as one of the greatest ways of understanding that period. That is an untapped treasure trove. And I may give a plug for the Hoover Institution, where I just spent a few weeks recently, which has virtually all of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty archives, hundreds of thousands of materials, programs, in addition to which the OSI, the Open Society Institute in Budapest, has several, probably tens and tens of thousands of broadcasts available online that if you know the language, you can just sit at home, plug in, and listen to yourself.
An amazing tool for researchers of the era.
Material is there, and I'm hoping that young researchers will take advantage of it and really look at one of the amazing and wonderful and undertold stories of the Cold War.
That's right. Well, we close our conversations here on Chatter by reaching into our chatter box and pulling out a random question. Mark, if you could give one piece of advice to your 20-year-old self, what would it be?
Follow the big stories of the world. In other words, look at issues that face that generation. In a sense, I did that. I was going to be a lawyer, and my college advisor said, there's so many lawyers. Do something that is really significant. And he said, the Soviet Union and then China are the two most significant issues facing the world. This being I'm talking about the mid-1960s, late 1960s.
Yeah.
And I followed that advice, and I'm really happy I did. But I would look at today's world and say, well, what are the big issues, whether they are, and where your interest lies? So maybe for some it will be climate change. For others it might be ecology. For some it might be national security. I think national security is an extremely high issue for today's 20-year-olds to look at. And I may give a plug for the University of Texas at Austin, where I am, which has a wonderful and very, very robust national security program for undergraduates and graduates. So there could be a host of important issues, but I would say look beyond your personal life to the kinds of issues that your generation is going to have to face. And in my case, the Soviet Union, the Cold War was really the big issue that we all faced.
Well, it sounds like you got some good advice from a wise person, and now you can pass that on when you teach the students at UT and pass on some wisdom similarly. Mark, thank you so much for joining me, talking through these issues in depth, and we look forward to your future research and hopefully the new book on radio liberty and what lessons it can teach us now. Hopefully it won't take too long, because I think that insight is needed right now given what's going on in the world.
Well, thank you very much, David. Really appreciate it.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.